Hey everybody, Quantum back here again, and we have just seen the conclusion of the Disney Lorcana Challenge in Bologna, Italy. Happened the first weekend of August, 1,886 players, and to top it all off, a Ruby Sapphire, which I believe is the first time Ruby Sapphire has taken a Disney Lorcana Challenge, ended up winning the whole event. Very interesting list, we'll take a look at that, but why this stuff is relevant as we move into Shimmering Skies is because we'll see kind of how the metagame is shaping up. You can see here from the limited information we have on the topping lists, there weren't a lot of Bucky Emerald Steel discard decks, and we know that this deck is going away come the Lorcana Challenge in Toronto, which is still only set for meta. It will be in a very awkward place because it won't really be a meta where we're able to test a lot because it'll be post Bucky errata but before Shimmering Skies. But why this is important is because we need to make sure that we take a look at these decks, see if any of them are translatable into Shimmering Skies. Do these decks get new tools that make them better with Shimmering Skies? And based on what we anticipate or what we will see in Shimmering Skies, what new decks will emerge? Are these existing decks going to be good into that meta or bad, right? So let's go ahead and jump straight in by taking a look at the winning list. This list looks very powerful because, as we know, Lucky Dime into Tamatoa seems almost unstoppable at times. We are getting new item and location-based removal in form of like Simba and Cusco, and there's like I think a couple actions or something that also deal with them. But this list focuses on basically dealing with your opponent's board up to a certain point, and then Tamatoa Dime for game. It focuses on early game stabilizing with things like Gaston, for example, in order to deal with Ruby Amethyst Sisu. It of course plays Be Prepared, Maui's, even small Sisus with ice blocks at 4, by the way. And I've talked about this interaction, how powerful this interaction is, so I'm glad this is getting some love now. And then the fact that this Sisu also is kind of facilitator for the big Sisu shift for additional board wipes. So it's just constant removal, dealing with your opponent's threats until you're able to establish the Lucky Dime and Tamatoa. And it's very easy for your Tamatoa to go from 0 to 20 in one turn, because not only are you generating items off the Queen and Scuttle, but you just play like 23 items. So you're just drawing items and playing them, a lot of which are one-drop items. You can see here 4 Ice Blocks, 4 Popsicle, 2 Shield of Virtue, and 3 Vitalosphere. Again, this is another card that I broke down a little bit at the start of Ursula's Return, and I said giving Rush is like really underrated. Like, it's a very powerful effect in a deck that can ramp, which, as you probably have noticed, there's not a lot of ramp in here. There's no one jumps, there's no how far I'll go, and there's only 3 Fishbone Quills, because you're able to play on curve more or less with a deck like this, because again, you're not worried about building up a board. You're just worried about, let me deal with your board, so I'll brawl your stuff, Teeth and Ambitions, your stuff, Sisu, Maui, Be Prepared, Sisu, Big Sisu wipe, and then once everything is set up with the items, I clutch it out with the Tamatoa. The Queen has an interesting interaction. If this comes down on 3 and you have a Shield of Virtue from either turn 1 or turn 2, you're able to Queen, get an item, use Shield of Virtue, ready the Queen, exert it again, get another item. And the card draw engine, and this is the major point of this deck, which I kind of try to break down in previous Ruby Sapphire videos. And I've always said, I mean, Ruby Sapphire is an insanely strong deck. The only thing holding it back is its draw engines. Tried Dinner Bells, tried Maurice's Workshops, but they didn't really gel too well. Well, this build with the Queen and Maurice's Workshop and the amount of items that this person plays, because they're not actually on that many uninkables. They're only on, I think, 17, right? Let's see here. 3 Be Prepared, 2 C, so that's 5, 8, 10, 14, 18. Okay, so 18 uninkables, unless I did my math wrong. So not like the 22 to 24 that we have seen traditionally. So the deck is a little bit more forgiving, and you're playing a lot of lower cost uninkables, right? Like Sisu coming down on 3, Ice Block on 1. Some of your higher cost uninkables are just what the deck naturally plays, like Be Prepared, Lucky Dime, and Sisu, right? So it's a very versatile deck. Getting Maurice's Workshop, especially more than one in rotation, and then just using it to draw a bunch of cards is very powerful. It obviously outplays Bucky Discard completely. And then being able to stabilize with Be Prepared just let you easily move into the Tamatoa for game. And if you watch the finals match, you would think that, yeah, like Ruby Sapphire has a really good time into Amber Steel's Song. Well, it usually does, but Ruby Sapphire has traditionally struggled with aggro. And this is a very aggro-oriented list of Amber Steel. You know, in trying to play Amber Steel myself, and I'm by no means an Amber Steel Song player, I find it very hard to play the control-oriented version, the ones that we saw from like I guess set 1 wasn't really too control-oriented because it still played like the Shift Rockstar Stitch line. But you can tell by this version here, for Cinderella, this is more of a control card. Golden Harp at 3. This is an aggro card. Robin Hood. This is an aggro card for the shift. Smee, Piglet. These are aggro cards. Necessities is a tempo, or not tempo, a control card. Ursula is a control card. Ariel, control card. Lawrence is an aggro card. So like a very heavy low to the ground aggro package, especially in the 1 and 2 drop slots. And then they seek to control board states to just continue to aggro quest for game. And in game 1 of the finals, the Amber Steel Song player was a higher seed, I think by like 1 point. And they ended up going to 19 lore. And then they just couldn't get that last piece of lore because they're not on flutes. But the Ruby Sapphire player just knows, like, as long as I stop you from getting to 20, like, it doesn't matter if you're at 19. I can be at 0, and I can just win the game from 0 to 20. Interesting list. Perdita as well has a lot of utility with this package, low to the ground package here, bringing back Ursula or Smee or Piglet, right? We saw that with the Disney Lorcana Challenge in Atlanta with the Amethyst player that won it, using Perdita to great effect. And it's funny because a lot of people thought this card was absolutely going to fall off. I said it was going to get worse for sure because of brawls and stuff, right? But it still showed to be very powerful in the meta, and it got second place here. So I think Perdita is another one of those cards that, while it somewhat can get worse over time, it also gets better. What's unfortunate is, the opponent that he played in the finals was on the small Sisu, which, for 3 out the Perdita. I don't think that ever came up, but just having it there, if it did happen, would be really bad for this player. But yeah, an aggro version of Amber Steel Song seems to be the way you have to go. The match that was off stream, I think this player got top 2, or was this the player that ended up winning the whole thing last time in Europe? I don't remember. I think Ruben may have won. So he got top 4 again. Basically, he got top 4 twice. So really, really consistent player. Once again, showcasing Ruby Amethyst. We have our own version of this kind of player in North America, Kapu, I think, who's top 8'd twice. He's got 2 golden Mickeys as well. So I think Ruben is the other player that has joined that club. But yeah, you can see here, Trinabox followers, Flynn Rider, Madam Mim, Brawl, Friends, Mim, Maleficent, Sisu. This is just a standard list. Be King Undisputed at 3 until you get to the Super Goof. Now this is a new card that's being reintroduced into the deck, which is very interesting. So yeah, 2 Super Goof, 4 Goat, 4 Rabbit, 4 Castle, 4 Maui, 3 Medusa, 4 Be Prepared. So a very interesting list. I actually don't know what they cut traditionally in order to include the 2 Super Goof. Obviously they're not running Crab. I guess they're just stuck on 4 1-drops as well. So, no Tremaines and stuff either. So, yeah, Super Goof I think is a really good card. I think it gets better over time for sure. Ruby Amethyst I think does translate into the next set. Obviously, what really will limit this deck is Emerald decks running the new Prince John Mirror. Because a deck like this has absolutely no answer to Prince John's Mirror. You're limited to 3 cards in hand, which isn't the end of the world. You can still play under that, especially if they get Prince John out like too late or on the draw and you're on the play and you're able to dump your hand. Because Prince John Mirror resolves at the end of the turn. So if you have like 5 cards in your hand and you're able to end on 3, then you don't discard anything. But I do think that card limits the potential of Ruby Amethyst, where traditionally Ruby Amethyst has been so strong for the simple fact that they always have like 7+ cards in hand. So no matter what the situation is, they always have an answer, given that they're Ruby, right? So this deck will translate, but I think it does get hard checked by something like Prince John's Mirror potentially. Amber Steel Song I think translates the best with the new Naveen, but it depends on how popular Sapphire is going to be in the meta, because this deck still suffers into Sapphire. The aggro versions can definitely hold their own, but if a deck like this, which I think does translate into the meta, because what really checks a deck like this? A very heavy item removal deck, like the new Heavy Storm, as I call it, I'll flatten them or whatever to remove all items. But this deck looks to be very strongly positioned going into the next set. What's funny is I think it was it game 3 or game 2? I think it was game 3 of the finals. The Ruby Sapphire player, this player here, was drawing so many friggin' cards off of Maurice's Workshop. The Amber Steel Song player was in top deck mode, and he was counting his deck because he was like, a win condition for me is top decking a whole new world, because I haven't seen one yet. He didn't play any whole new worlds in game 3. Whole new worlding into whole new world would win him the game because he would deck his opponent out. That's how much he drew off of Maurice's Workshop. So as I've said in the past, If this deck's main weakness is that you so heavily rely on Hiram that now you're just like, well, between the Queen and Maurice's Workshop and Scottles and Maurice's Workshop, I solved that card draw problem. What stops this deck? Right? Like, you need constant item removal. And the deck plays 23 items. So unless you have like mass item removal, which is basically the I'll flatten them song, this deck is just going to always have insane amounts of items. Like, yes, you can out the Maurice's Workshop, but after a certain point, they don't even care because they play 4. Are you really going to be able to out all 4? And they probably just can, not that they would, but they could recur them with the Tamatoa. But if they're at the point where they're dropping the Tamatoa, they're likely winning the game anyways. Like, because they're just diming it multiple times, right? Even if you deal with the one that they drop, they'll probably have another one or just have more dime targets, like, and they just draw into more. Like, it's really, really strong. I believe a Sapphire Steel list got top 4, but they didn't show it. I don't know if it was this person. I don't think it was. They have him listed as top 8, but I think Europe is much bigger on Sapphire Steel than we are. And I do really like this deck. But after seeing what the draw engine of the Ruby Sapphire deck did, which, I was aware of this deck. Moyen actually showcased this deck, I think, against Savage in the final days of Pixelborn. But I guess they never really ironed out the kinks. So obviously this player who won did. I don't know if he was working with Moyen or other people in Europe to build that deck. But Sapphire Steel remains to be one of the stronger ink pairings, I think, and it continues to do very well in Europe. It's very sad that it didn't end up winning an event in this cycle of the meta for Ursula's Return. Only one Rise of the Titans, which is very interesting because, this deck could suffer into Ruby Amethyst. But they're on Captain Hooks and they're on the Argus, so more anti-aggro. Only 3 Babooms. They're on Mickeys and no 1-jumps. So isolation from Tremaine, potentially. 2 Bells, 2 Beast Hard-Headed, 3 Grab Your Swords. So again, just probably teched against the Bucky meta, or Bucky Emerald Steel discard. 2 Let It Goes, 1 Aerial. 4 Tinkerbells, only 3 Tamatoas instead of 4, and 2 Lucky Dimes. So an interesting list, not necessarily how I would opt to build it, but obviously Mr. Temerman did very well, coming in top 8. Dinka Fam, this is a Yu-Gi-Oh player actually, in Europe, opting to play a much more standard build of Ruby Sapphire. I'm a huge fan of the Dig a Little Deeper card. I think this card is fantastic. I've picked up foil copies on the Hercules as well to directly deal with a castle. On 1 Great Stone Dragon, which I think this card is really only good if you play more than 30 characters, but a 1-of is probably fine. Still on the Maleficent Dragons, on Madame Medusas. What's interesting is the other list was not on either Maleficent or Madame Medusa, by the way. Because why do you need those if you're just drawing, like, 3 or 4 cards a turn? You'll just be prepared at some point. They were on the Queen for Rush, they're on the 1-jumps, and they're on the Vitalis Spheres, which does a couple of things, right? It can make your Madame Medusa have Rush, be a 6/4, but mainly, it kind of has an overlap ability where you banish it and you give Maui +2, so that Maui becomes an 8/5, and now he can run over Castle as well. So interesting interactions. For how far all goes, probably a ton of uninkables, right? 13 in the song count alone, 15, 16, 20. So yeah, a lot of uninkables, but I mean, the winning list only had 18 too. Let's see the farewell of Emerald Steel discard with Bucky here. I mean, is there really anything else to review with this deck? This deck has really fallen off, in my opinion. It was definitely the strongest deck at the start of the meta, but as people have learned and adapted, this deck is definitely no longer the best deck. It's just too inconsistent, in my opinion. And while it still has like unbeatable play patterns, like lines of play, it's very fragile. And once you know how to disrupt it, they just break down. There was, to be fair, it was earlier rounds of Lorcana, but there was a showcase against Sapphire Steel, and I think the Emerald Steel player ended up playing like double Diablo on board, and like had another character, and the steel Sapphire player had to grab your swords in hand, and so next turn he just grabbed your swords, and the Emerald Steel player had like 1 or 2 cards in hand, and the Sapphire Steel player had like 5, and they still had their board. The entire Emerald Steel player's board was wiped. At that exact moment, the game was over. So it was on like turn 4, I think, because the the Sapphire Steel player ramped. But like that's how fragile Emerald Steel discard is. Moyen ended up making top 16, so congrats to him. Falling 1 short of the Golden Mickey though, unfortunately. Maybe he'll get it next time. Great player. I'm sure he'll get one eventually if he doesn't have one already, I don't think. but opting to play Sapphire Steel. So you guys already know I'm a huge fan of this. So, big fan of Moyen and a fan of this deck list. So I hope he can continue to pilot this to great success in the next set. I do think Sapphire Steel will always be relevant just because it has such powerful lines of play, similar to Amber Steel's Song, but just like stronger, if that makes sense. Because ramping into huge threats with card advantage resets thanks to a whole new world is just really, really strong. One Fire the Cannons, interesting. Okay, of course, the standard item package, 4 Babooms, 4 Smee. 2 Argus, 3 Rise of the Titan. So a lot of location hate and item hate, by the way. It's kind of overlooked, forgotten that this card also deals with items. 3 Mickeys, no 1-jumps. So he's doing his best to tech against Bucky discard, right? So Ursula can't rip 1-jumps. Doing his best to tech against Ruby Amethyst. 4 Hero, 4 Whole New World. 2 Beast Tragic Hero, which is fair. In some matchups, this card can be absolutely momentous, and in others, it's just ink. Just like Cogsworth. Into Ruby, this card is bad. Into Steel, this card wins you the game, right? So a very stark contrast. 3 Grab Your Swords. So it's kind of interesting. I remember when I first built Blue Steel back at the start of Ursula's Return, I was like, yeah, 4 Grab Your Swords because, Emerald Steel Bucky is just like so strong. I mean, the meta has evolved, obviously, but it's interesting to see this card coming back up in the count. I do think especially in Sapphire variations of Sapphire Steel, you can definitely run 4. This card will remain to be pretty strong, especially if aggro comes back as a big threat in the next set with the new Daisy Duck. 2 Gaston, interesting. 4 Tinkerbell, 2 Lucky Dime, and 4 Tamatoa. What's the uninkable count here? 7, 9, 12, 14, 15. So very, big props to Moyen for keeping that uninkable count very low. No Bell, no Ariel, right? Gaston is a good dime target. Tinkerbell, Cogsworth, Beast, Tragic Hero. No Beast Hard-Headed, which is interesting, right? Opting instead for the extra Rise of the Titans and using Beast Tragic Hero instead. Which I would say is a decent call because, Beast Tragic Hero at least always can do something in every matchup potentially, whereas Beast Hard-Headed, is just ink in a lot of matchups. It's really good when it comes into play, like when it actually has meaning, but other than that, it's not doing too much. Whatever Ed called it, so this just looks like a standard. Well, I shouldn't say standard, but Ruby Amethyst for the most part. 8 1-drops instead of the 4 that Ruben played, and opting to play the Sisu as well for the shift and just a good board clearing card. This is the variation that Ed won with, I believe. Hence why he called it whatever Ed called it when Ed was also running that Sisu. And I think there's not too much else to really go over here. I guess we can look at Frank Karsten's Steel Song just because we know he's a veteran of TCGs. I actually, what's funny? I played Magic back in 2006, 2007. And I remember watching Worlds when Katsuhiro Mori won. And I didn't actually realize it at the time until I went back recently, like maybe a couple of weeks ago, and looked up what was actually relevant in Magic back then. And I didn't realize that Frank Karsten was actually the finalist against Katsuhiro Mori in that 20 years ago almost, right? In that Worlds match. And I was like, holy crap, Frank Karsten, yeah. I knew he was a Magic Hall of Famer, right? I believe he's a Hall of Famer. But I know he's a big name in Magic, but I forgot that he was actually the guy that was doing work in Magic back then, right? And I'm sure he's done a lot of work in Magic since then, but very interesting. But you can see here, these Amber Steel Song players, they're all opting towards the more aggro-oriented build, right? Smees and Piglets. I talked about this in my Market Watch, picking up 4 copies of this. And Ariel's, this card is just great value. Rapunzel. On 3 Grab Your Swords, we've seen Amber Steel Song reduce this. Only 1 Tinkerbell, still opting for the Robin Hood package. But also on the Cinderella Stout-Hearted. It's got the shift target. This card can, again, auto-win you games against opposing Steel matchups. Not too great into Ruby, but still a big threat that comes down and is tough to deal with. You have to have the direct answer. But yeah, aside from that, only 2 Lawrence too, by the way. So not as aggro, and one World's Greatest Criminal. Interesting. How many songs in total? 18. Okay, so a little less than what you've seen. Also no flutes, which is very interesting. So when you take a look at a list like this and you don't see flutes, they beat the Sapphire decks by trying to aggro them out. Because Sapphire decks can have a trouble dealing with aggro, right? They need to see multiple, and the Babooms may not do as much as you think it does, but they need to see multiple forms of removal very early. And that can be very hard for them to do, especially when a lot of their cards focus on ramp, right? So you mitigate your worst matchup. It has a good matchup into Ruby Amethyst and Bucky Discard and whatnot. I don't know if I'd say a good matchup into Bucky Discard. Like on paper, it would seem like it would, but it really depends on how the play pattern goes. Because if they like Ursula Deceiver rip your whole new world when you really needed to cast it to generate a reset, like you probably just lose. Similar to why I think against Amber Emerald, you could potentially really suffer with Amber Steel Song, despite in theory, this deck having all the answers, because, Grab Your Swords wipes out the Prince John and whatever, and Whole New World draws you the cards that you were having to discard. But, like, if they end up discarding your cards before you can use them, like, you just lose. So, Amber Steel Song, interesting. A lot of it being represented here, along with a lot of Sapphire. So, I think North America is more on Emerald Steel and Ruby Amethyst, whereas it looks like Europe is more on Sapphire and Amber Steel Song. So very, very interesting stark contrast. Well, that's going to do it for the summary of Bologna. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it if you made it this far. And hopefully you can also see how some of these decks may or may not be translated into the new meta with Shimmering Skies. Anyways, thank you again for watching. Quantum is out.